Hello, everyone. This is Sasha Tenzin from Focus the Nation, one of the Energy Leadership Coordinators, introducing you to the F2A webinar series. This webinar will be on the Scale of Energy Challenge. And with us today, we have Jesse Jenkins, who's actually one of our advisory board members here at Focus the Nation. Jesse is a graduate student as well as a researcher at MIT. He's looking to earn his PhD in the Engineering Systems Division. He was actually the director of the Energy and Climate Policy at the Breakthrough Institute in Oakland. And he also is a frequent blogger for the Energy Collective. You can find a lot of his takes and articles on their website and through their listserv. Through MIT, he's working with the production in the Innovation Economy Project, which is looking to closely examine the role and importance of manufacturing and innovation processes and the functioning of advanced economies and kind of how that all interrelates. It's going to go into basically a primer, Energy 101, of just the scale of energy challenge and what we need to focus on, the small foundational elements we need to focus on to get us into the larger picture. So with that, Jesse, I'm going to hand it off to you. You can go on ahead with your presentation.
Great. Thanks, Sasha. I think I have control of the presentation now. Great. So as Sasha mentioned, this is going to be sort of an Energy 101 primer, and some of this material is drawn from the great the Watt primer that the Focus the Nation team put together, and other content is drawn from my previous presentations on this topic. And this talk is going to be organized in 4 parts. The first section is going to be focused on trying to get our heads around the scale of the energy challenge and what it might entail. Second, we're going to go over just briefly some basics on energy and power and the units that are used to describe energy and power, and so we can get a sense for that. Third, we're going to come back to talk about the interrelation between energy and human development. And finally, we're going to conclude by looking at sort of where we stand with a set of clean energy technology options in terms of their price and performance and how those compare to conventional energy sources. So to begin with, for part 1, let's see, can I advance the slides here? Oh. How do we switch over to the other slide deck? Does that do it? Sasha, can you see that?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Yes, I can see that.
Okay, great. All right, just want to double check before I start steamrolling ahead. Okay, cool. So technical difficulties solved. All right, so yeah, part 1 on the scale of the energy challenge. So today we are a planet of roughly 7 billion people, but by mid-century, global population projections estimate that we'll stand at a projected 9 to 10 billion people. Over that same time period, even if per capita incomes increase from about $8,000 per person today on average worldwide to just $15,000 per person, which is an interesting number. It's roughly in the range of what some sociologists have called the happiness threshold, where increased income is no longer strongly correlated with increased happiness or other welfare indicators. But even if we could perfectly distribute wealth at $15,000 per person, we would still see global GDP triple by about mid-century. Likely we're not going to see that perfect distribution of wealth, but we are going to see substantial increase in economic activity worldwide as human aspirations drive economic growth. What that means is that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, projects that energy use will more than double by mid-century. Even with a doubling of historic energy efficiency improvement rates, energy use would still increase dramatically, at least by 50% by mid-century. It's a little surprised that energy use is going to increase. Virtually all of the demand growth is projected to arise from developing economies, so emerging countries in Africa, Asia, South America, and elsewhere. And that's not surprising because a full third of the global population remains locked in what we call energy poverty, a lack of access to modern energy supplies, including electricity. For example, all of sub-Saharan Africa consumes less electricity than the state of New York alone does. while more than 2 billion people still burn dung and wood for their primary energy needs, relying on the same simple source of energy, fire, it was discovered by our ancestors 400,000 years ago. And of course, there's no guarantee that fossil energy supplies can continue to meet rising global energy demand on their own. Securing a diversified, affordable, and secure energy system that can meet rising global energy needs is also a key imperative. Already, global oil prices are straining under rising demand, with dangerous market volatility and rising prices the obvious result. The International Energy Agency, a global energy watchdog, projects that oil prices will remain high over the coming decades, rising to perhaps $210 per barrel in nominal terms by 2035. The United States is perhaps the most vulnerable economy in the world to such shocks. Estimates of the economic damages wrought by oil price shocks over the past 40 years total in the trillions of dollars, and each major recession since 1970 has been preceded by and in part precipitated by a surge in global oil prices. And despite decades of talk about freeing America from foreign oil, oil imports still bleed more than $1.4 billion out of the U.S. economy each and every day. That's another 1.4 billion reasons to get serious about finding a new way to fuel global energy needs. And at the same time that we must meet the expanding energy needs of a modernizing and growing global population, our climate scientists tell us that we must cut global carbon emissions as close to zero as quickly as possible. More precisely, the exact emissions target and timeline depends on a combination of what range of temperature rise or atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases we think we can tolerate as a society, and when we can manage to cause global CO2 levels to peak. Here's a range of CO2 stabilization pathways from the IPCC. The higher the band you see here, the higher the eventual temperature rise associated with that stabilization path. As you can see, however, they all converge towards zero, so keep that target in mind. We should be aiming towards net zero global CO2 emissions as quickly as possible. Here's the temperature ranges associated with each of these scenarios. So as you can see, the colors match on each graph. So the green band, for example, is associated with a 450 parts per million of CO2 equivalent stabilization target, and a mean temperature rise globally of a little over 2 degrees Celsius on average, but with a possible range of 1.75 to 3.25 degrees. And as you move upwards from green towards yellow, orange, red, etc., you see that the possible temperature ranges rise. And of course, at the flip side, the stabilization path gets a bit easier. In short, though, moving towards zero carbon as quickly as possible means that we must set out on a course to rebuild the entire global energy system with zero carbon energy, and to make sure that system is capable of providing 1.5 to 2 times more energy than the entire existing infrastructure can today. And we have to do all of that by roughly mid-century. In short, tackling climate change while fueling the economic aspirations of a growing world population calls for an enormous, unprecedented energy system transformation. McKinsey Global Research describes this clean energy challenge as comparable in magnitude to the labor productivity increases in the Industrial Revolution, but it will have to be achieved in 1/3 of the time if the world is to maintain current growth levels, while also tackling climate change. So labor productivity during the 130 years or so of the Industrial Revolution increased by a factor of 10. Our challenge now is to achieve a 10-fold decrease in the amount of CO2 generated per unit of economic output, and we have only about 40 or 50 years to do so. To put that in other terms, energy experts with the International Energy Agency have described what it would take to reduce emissions in half by 2050. Here's what they said. We would start by accelerating the rate of efficiency improvement, or the improvement in energy intensity, or the amount of energy required to produce 1 unit of economic activity. The annual rate of energy intensity improvement would have to increase from a projected 1.7% per year under business as usual to over 2.6%, far ahead above any experienced global rate to date. Then you'd have to start building new energy supplies. First, we'd start with building 30 new nuclear power plants, 24,000 2-megawatt wind turbines, 200 biomass power plants, each 50 megawatts each in size, 6 big hydroelectric dams the size of the Hoover Dam, over 2 gigawatts each, 55 coal or natural gas power plants, all fitted with carbon capture and storage technology to permanently store the CO2 emissions. Solar photovoltaic panels covering 5.5 times the area of Manhattan, and 55 large concentrating solar power plants, the kind you see out in the desert in California, each of 250 megawatts in size. And we'd also need 45 100 megawatt units of geothermal energy, and we need to do that every year from now until 2050. So hopefully by now we get a sense of the scale of the challenge. What it means fundamentally is that we need clean, cheap, and massively scalable clean energy technologies. So whatever you think about climate change, energy security, or the economic opportunities of a growing world, or any of the other interrelated energy challenges we face, clean, cheap energy will be key to solving that problem. At present, we have all the technologies we need to get started on this task. Wind, solar, biomass, and others can start making a dent today. But to truly bring clean energy to global scale, we're going to need to accelerate energy innovation to deliver better, cheaper, low-carbon technologies in order to make all the things we're going to try to tackle here much easier. If clean energy is going to power the planet, all of it, not just the rich first-world nations, we're going to have to make clean energy cheap. The energy challenge is admittedly much more complex than that simple phrase. And throughout the rest of the webinars and briefings you'll get from Focus the Nation and with the help of the Watt Primer, you'll get a handle on more of that complexity. But in my assessment, at its core, our interlinking global climate and energy challenges hinges on the task summed up in this simple phrase that I want to drive home today. Make clean energy cheap. That's the heart of the challenge we face in the 21st century. All right, I'm going to pause there and see if we have any questions on that section of the presentation. And just to remind everybody, what's up next is what the what. We're going to start going over some of the terms and terminology and energy and power, then energy and development, and finally, how much does clean energy currently cost compared to the targets that we need for clean, cheap energy. So Sasha, do you have any questions at this point?
Sure, yeah, thank you, Jesse. You mentioned massive energy efficiency retrofits and audits and things that might be like low-hanging fruit. But where else can we cut costs to make clean energy cheap? Or maybe what sectors have the most potential to start reducing the expense?
Well, that's a great question. I think we'll come back to that a little bit in the fourth part of the presentation as well, when we look at the current costs of different technologies, so we can sort of see how far they have to come. But one of the things that's interesting about many technologies is that they tend to get cheaper over time. I mean, you think about the power and cost per unit of computation we have from computers. And those have been progressing at what we call Moore's law, which is that sort of the power, the number of transistors and calculations you can get on a single chip doubles roughly every 18 months. We actually see similar trends in performance improvements for a lot of other technologies. So, for example, the cost of solar panels per unit of capacity has fallen by about 20% for every doubling in global capacity deployed. And that's continued for quite some time. We have similar trends for wind, for conventional combustion generation technologies. And so in general, what we see is that the technologies that are improving most rapidly are those that are least mature and have the smallest capacity base installed so far. And to continue to keep up that rate of improvement for more mature technologies requires incrementally more effort. So, for example, there are estimates that wind energy, which is one of the more mature and widely adopted sources of renewable energy today, could come down in price by another 20 to 50% over the next decade, whereas the cost of solar may come down quite a bit more dramatically over that next time period. So in general, I think what engineers and business innovators and policymakers and scientists all have to think about is where can we continue to wring out those cost declines in each of these technologies? If you're an expert in material science, what are the new materials that we need? If you're a business major or a business innovator or entrepreneur, how can you come up with a business model that can reduce the costs and overhead required to develop new energy technologies or put them into use? If you're an engineer, how can we make these things more efficient or more robust so that they need less repairs? There's always sort of ways that we can continue those cost improvement trends, and I think that's one of the key challenges for society as a whole right now.
Great, thank you. I think that's everything that I have for right now.
Great. And we'll come back, like as I said, in part 4 to look at sort of where we stand in terms of the current costs of some of these technologies relative to their fossil energy competitors. Great. So before I move on to the next section on energy and power, I just wanted to make a quick note, which is to say that I've been focused here on the energy challenge, the interlinking challenge of fueling global development with abundant and affordable energy while mitigating dangerous climate change, which requires us to make clean energy cheap. But I have to note that the climate challenge is not strictly synonymous with the energy challenge, although the two clearly have a lot to do with one another. So for example, this squiggly squid graph here is a really interesting chart produced by the World Resources Institute that shows sort of the full global flow of greenhouse gas emissions. So on the left-hand side, you can see the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and on the right-hand side, you can see the ultimate kind of greenhouse gas that's produced. There's more than just carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and other things like hydrofluorocarbons and PFCs are also greenhouse gases. And in the middle, you can see the end-use activity, or the reason we're using these energy sources and producing the CO2. And what I want to note is that, well, energy is about 2/3 of the total greenhouse gas flow. Other things besides energy are responsible for the other third. So things like industrial processes, land use changes, and agriculture are large, and also waste. Landfills and wastewater are also significant drivers of climate change. And so if we're thinking about climate, we do have to think more broadly than energy. For example, just something to think about for your own lives, agriculture, so the production of crops and in particular livestock, is responsible for about 13 or 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And that's larger in size than any individual energy consumption type, except for electricity and heating. So for example, that's agriculture and transportation. All transportation worldwide produces about as much CO2 and other greenhouse gases as our agriculture and food production systems. So for those of you who are working on other issues around agriculture, land use planning, urban development, waste management and recycling, all of this connects to the global energy and climate challenge in important ways. And so I just wanted to make sure I note that, even though this presentation is going to be focused mostly on energy. Okay, so moving on to part 2. Let's just take a minute to discuss some of the units of power and energy. What is a watt anyway, or a joule or a gigawatt? I've been throwing around some of those numbers already. Is that a big amount of energy or a small amount? And what's the difference between power and energy anyway? One thing that helps me keep track of these terms and understand them is to make the analogy to a bathtub or to water flow. I start by saying that power is the rate at which work can be performed. So power is a rate. That's important to keep in mind. Using our bathtub analogy, power is the rate at which water can flow out of the faucet and into the bathtub. Below, you'll see some common units of power that are used to describe power. You'll see watts most particularly, or their equivalents in terms of order of magnitude. Kilowatts is 1,000 watts, megawatts is 1,000,000 watts, etc. But you'll also see when it comes to engines, you'll see things like horsepower. Sometimes engine power, particularly in Europe, is also measured in terms of kilowatts, but here in the United States we use terms like horsepower. And for heat, you'll see things like flow rates, sort of transfers of heat, or British thermal units per second or per minute, or thermal megawatts sometimes, which is an equivalent to the electricity terms. Note that many of these terms don't have a per hour or per minute or per time term associated with them, even though these are in fact rates. So you think about miles per hour as another rate, it has the per hour term in it. Well, these don't, and that's because a lot of these terms are actually already defined as a rate. So for example, watts, which are the most commonly used for electricity, are defined inherently as a joule, which is another unit of energy actually, per second. And so you resist the temptation to write things like watts per second or watts per hour because A, that would be redundant, and B, actually technically inaccurate. So just keep that in mind as you work on these terms. Okay, so if power is a rate, energy is a quantity of work performed. So if we're thinking about our bathtub analogy again, energy is the volume of water in our bathtub. There are unfortunately lots of units for energy, since each type of energy source or fuel tends to have its own specialized units. So just to make things extra confusing, here are a few of them. For electricity, the most common are kilowatt hours or megawatt hours. Again, there's 100 or 1,000 megawatt hours in a kilowatt hour. Or sorry, the other way around, 1,000 kilowatt hours in a megawatt hour. For heat, you'll see things like calories or joules. Also, food is measured in terms of its calorie content, or how much energy we can derive from eating that food. You also see British thermal units, or BTUs, sometimes measured on the scale of quadrillion BTUs. It's 10 to the 12th BTUs. And then each quantity of fuel, as I mentioned, often has its own unit. So tons of coal, barrels of oil, sometimes also tons, cubic feet or million British thermal units of natural gas. So just be on the lookout for each type of fuel often has its own energy unit, and those can all be converted. And you can find energy converters online. It's also worth noting that these can be easily converted from power to energy or vice versa because of their inherent relationship. Power, the rate at which work can be performed, times time equals energy, or a quantity of work performed. At the same time, energy divided by time equals power. So it's always possible to sort of go back and forth. So if you have a 100 kilowatt bulb, that's a unit, or 100 watt bulb, sorry, that's a unit of power, and it's running for an hour, the amount of energy it consumes is 100 watt hours. Just to give you a sense of sort of the orders of magnitude of some things, things that are measured on the scale of a watt, so that's 1 to 1,000 watts, are a night light. This might be as little as 4 watts. The typical household incandescent bulb is on the order of 60 to 100. Solar panels, individual solar panels, are often on this order of hundreds of watts. The amount of sunshine that strikes 1 square meter of the Earth on average is 750 watts. Kilowatts are where we start to get into things like the average power consumption of an entire United States home, the size of a full residential photovoltaic system, or when you turn to the tens or hundreds of kilowatts, the power rating of a typical car engine. Megawatts are where we start to get into things like power plants. The max thrust of power of engines on a Boeing 747 is 77 megawatts. A Nimitz-class aircraft carrier can crank out over 200 megawatts. And then you start seeing things like power plants or whole wind farms that are on the scale of hundreds or even thousands of megawatts. Something to keep in mind is that a large coal-fired or nuclear power plant might be on the order of 1,000 megawatts. And that gets us to a gigawatt, which is 1,000 megawatts. So there you see things like large hydroelectric dams, like Hoover Dam or China's Three Gorges Dam, or the total global installed nuclear power capacity as of 2008 was measured at 367 gigawatts worldwide. And finally, you get to terawatts, or 10 to the 12th, and that's where we start to see measurements of the total size of consumption or power capacity in an entire country, or 15 terawatts being about how much total power, electric power, the entire world used as of 2004. So keep those numbers. You can use these as references to just sort of get a sense of when somebody throws numbers like a gigawatt or a megawatt out, what physical scale are we talking about? Okay, so that's enough of the energy and power units. Sasha, I don't know if you have any questions on that section before I move on.
Nope, I have no questions here.
Great.
Thanks for the visual. Really great breakdown of just.
And a lot more on that in the Watt primer as well for reference. Okay, so we'll get back into the applied questions. Back to part 3, energy and development. I really want to drive this point home because I think it provides a piece of the story that's often missing when we talk about the energy challenge. We often talk about what it takes to supply enough oil or energy for a country like the United States to become energy independent, or we talk about the climate challenge and how much clean energy we need to drive down global emissions. But I think in a world where 2 billion people still lack access to modern energy, where 5 billion people are still striving towards the kinds of quality of living that we see in the developed world, it's really important to think about the linkages between energy and human development as well. So how do we think about fueling global development and expanding human welfare? Well, first, I want to come back to this idea that more than 2 billion people, or roughly a third of the global population, still burns things like dung and wood as their primary sources of energy. And more than 1.3 billion people worldwide lack access to basic electricity. So while it's hard to picture from our comfortable lives here in the United States or elsewhere, surrounded by the many wonders offered by modern energy systems, that's the state for a huge chunk of the world's population. And the human toll of this energy poverty is quite dire. The World Health Organization estimates that the indoor air pollution caused primarily by the burning of wood, dung, coal, and other primitive fuels in indoor cook stoves kills 1.5 to 2 million people worldwide every year. That's nearly 5,500 deaths per day, and more than half of them are children under 5 years old. In developing nations, in fact, only malnutrition, HIV, and other sexually transmitted diseases and lack of access to clean water kills more people than the health impacts of energy poverty. And of course, once you have access to your first bit of energy, that's only the first step on a chain of human development, which will demand ever more and more energy. Here you can see the impact that just having a single light bulb has for young students who can now extend their studying hours into the nighttime and tackle the educational opportunities that can provide them so many opportunities in the future. And of course, as we see human communities grow and develop, they consume ever more energy. So I think the challenge for us is to think about how do we continually provide growing supplies of energy for the world, even if as we think about how we might be able to reduce our energy consumption or improve our efficiency here in the developed countries. Just to drive this point home with some more statistics, if you haven't seen the site Gapminder, I definitely encourage you to check it out, gapminder.com. It includes a great set of data visualizations that allow you to visualize the relationships between all kinds of different economic and human development indicators. And the ones I'm going to show you here, I think, show a critical relationship between energy consumption and growing energy use and all kinds of indicators of human welfare. So this first chart shows us a strong correlation between per capita GDP, or economic activity, and energy use per person, or per capita energy consumption. Each of the dots represents an individual country plotted here, and their size represents the total amount of energy that country consumes. The big red dot there is China in the middle. The big yellow one on the top is the United States. I think Europe is there in green. And so this shows us here the strong upward relationship between rising per capita GDP and rising energy consumption. At the same time, maybe you don't like GDP as a sole measure of of human welfare. Clearly, it's just an economic term. So others have developed things like the Human Development Index, which combines all sorts of different measures of economic activity, of quality of life, of healthcare and educational outcomes, of equality. And again, we see this strong relationship between rising Human Development Index outcomes and energy use per person. To break this down a little bit more specifically, you see this decline in child mortality rate as energy consumption rises, and of course a similar increase in total life expectancy. So again, the point of all of this is to keep in mind that energy and development are inextricably linked, and that when we think about the energy challenge for the 21st century, it is clearly not just about reducing carbon emissions, as critical as that challenge is, but also about finding ways to do that while fueling the aspirations and human needs of a planet of 7 going on 9 or 10 billion people. Just pause there one more time to see if you have any questions before I move on to the final section.
No questions here. All very informative, though. Thank you.
Great. All right, part 4, the cost of clean energy. So if we're going to fuel the planet of 9 or 10 billion people, and we're going to do it without exacerbating climate change, the challenge again is to have a lot of clean and affordable and abundant energy. So where do we stand today? How affordable are our energy options? These graphics come straight from the Watt Primer, and they are a valiant effort to really try to come up with some hard data on where current energy technologies cost. These things change a lot from year to year, so take these as sort of indicative of where we stand, and maybe not hard numbers, although they're nice ranges here to give us a sense. But what I've plotted here on this version of the chart is that we see sort of the threshold for competing with new coal or natural gas power plants in the United States. The orange line shows you about the cost of a new coal-fired power plant, and the lower blue line shows you the cost of a new natural gas plant. What's interesting is that before 2008, those numbers were flipped. So natural gas was much more expensive than coal, and coal was really the challenger for renewables. Now, natural gas in the United States has gotten much cheaper due to the discovery and extraction of natural gas from shale resources here in the U.S. and elsewhere. And that's driven down the cost of gas, and so now combined cycle natural gas plants are really the plant to beat in terms of new capacity. So let's see where some of these other sources fall. Let's go back. Okay, so this first chart shows you advanced nuclear, geothermal, and biomass. These are the sort of dispatchable or controllable sources of renewable or zero carbon energy that we have at our disposal, the ones where you can flip a switch and turn them on or off or up or down. And that's important to meeting energy demand in a reliable way. So as you can see, the cost of advanced nuclear I should say there are 4 lines in each of these that indicate cost. The first is sort of the current cost under current policies, the blue. The green is if we stripped out all of the various federal incentives that are provided for each type of energy, and almost every energy technology gets some amount of federal incentives. The third number is what would happen if we implemented a fairly sizable tax or price on carbon dioxide, which would increase the price of coal and natural gas and other fossil fuels. And then the final one is what happens if we would increase the price of carbon and continue the federal incentives that are also on the table today. So I'm going to focus mostly on the blue line, which is the current power prices for these technologies. And as you can see, the new coal and new nuclear are roughly competitive, but as I mentioned, the real power plant to beat now is a new combined cycle gas plant, which is now quite a bit cheaper than a new nuclear power plant. Now, a nuclear power plant might last as long as 60 or 70 years, and of course, who knows what the natural gas price will be 10 years from now. The price of power from a natural gas plant is very dependent on the price of fuel. Something like 60% of the total cost per megawatt hour from a gas plant is determined by the cost of fuel, whereas for a nuclear plant, it's only 5 or 10% of the cost is from the cost of fuel. So the thing to think about is that over the long term, will the gas price rise enough that nuclear might be competitive? Geothermal and biomass are in similar, although a little bit better position. They are somewhat cheaper than nuclear. They're somewhat more cost competitive in some places with natural gas, although that cost competitiveness is dependent on the current incentives that are in place, the federal tax incentives for geothermal and biomass. So if we remove those and we went from the blue line to the green line, you'd notice that both of those sources would be competitive with coal, but also, again, not very competitive with new gas. All right, so I'm going to move on to wind and solar power, which are probably the ones we think of most when we think about renewables. These sources are not, they're called variable or intermittent sources of energy, and that they, or particularly wind and solar, that they vary when the wind or the sun is available. And so they also depend fundamentally on the quality of the resource, which differs from place to place. And so you get much larger bars here that indicate that, for example, a solar panel in California, in Southern California or Hawaii, is going to produce a lot more power for the same fixed cost than one in, say, Vermont or Northwestern Washington. But as what we can see here is that with the current subsidy regime in place, wind power is quite competitive with natural gas, and we are indeed seeing strong growth in wind energy production in the United States as long as that federal production tax credit remains. But when that tax credit expires, as it did briefly at the end of last year, the market comes crashing to a halt because outside of a few areas with excellent wind resources and easy access to existing transmission lines, wind is still not quite competitive with natural gas, although it's quite competitive with new coal. The same goes for solar photovoltaics or concentrated solar power plants, which are a bit more expensive at this point. But I should note that in many cases, solar photovoltaics are going to compete directly with retail electricity rates because you're going to put them on your rooftop and use them to avoid paying your retail electricity bill. And in this case, solar is often much more favorable. So that orange bar there that I've put in here, you can see, shows you the range of retail rates in the United States, which are roughly from $70 to $150 per megawatt hour, or what you usually see on your bill, more like 7 to 15 cents per kilowatt hour. In Hawaii, prices are way up there at $375 or $400 per megawatt hour because the island has to import lots of oil that it burns in oil-fired power plants to meet its energy needs. So already in Hawaii, solar, even without subsidies, is cost competitive. With subsidies, solar is competitive in any number of different states, California being the largest market for solar in the United States. And even without subsidies, solar is starting to become competitive with retail electricity prices in a number of different places. So what we can see from each of these is that renewables and even nuclear and biomass and others that we've seen earlier are on track to be cost competitive, but still have a remaining gap to close, further cost reductions that are needed to eliminate the need for any ongoing federal subsidies to be competitive in the energy markets and to start hopefully rapidly taking market share from coal and natural gas. Just going to leave it there, I guess. So that's kind of where we stand in terms of the current cost of energy and the innovation challenge that's needed to further reduce the cost and to develop the kinds of scalable, low-cost, and clean energy technologies needed to fuel global energy demand. Thanks. I'm happy to answer any questions now. And yeah.
Thank you so much. I have a couple questions for you, just in terms of the last slide. Really, is policy alone? Would you say that's one of the big needle movers to influence more sustainable energy technologies, or is there maybe something else involved as well?
Well, yeah, I think policy is a huge lever. I mean, you can see just on this slide here how much you move between the green and the blue line because of the addition of policy. So wind, for example, we offer a federal production tax credit that's worth about $22 per megawatt hour. So that's about a quarter or a third of the cost or value of the energy produced by these power plants. Similar with solar photovoltaics, the federal government will subsidize 30% of the cost of installing solar, and then states often offer additional incentives. So no doubt that public policy is critical to creating early markets for many of these technologies while they're still more expensive. And that's really important in this market more so than other markets because energy is a commodity. It's sort of like steel or iron or copper. We don't really care about the steel or the copper. We care about what you're going to make out of it. And that means that what we really value is the cost per unit. It's a commodity market where we care about dollars per megawatt hour, which is the chart we're looking at here. Now, that's different from something like a cell phone or a computer or a consumer electronics device where what we care about are the features. I care about the fact that I now have a smartphone that's small enough to fit in my pocket, has a battery that'll last for 8 or 10 hours, that can hook up to the internet at high speed wherever I am and whatever I want. Those are the kind of features we care about. And so when a new smartphone comes out on the market, I'm probably willing and others are willing to pay quite a bit more than for your conventional cell phone in order to get that technology. And then over time, that early market gives an opportunity for engineers and innovators and entrepreneurs to drive down the costs of supplying those services to the point where the technologies become wider adopted and more widely adopted as you go along. In the energy market, there's no early adopter other than policy or other than the federal government or state governments. I should say there are some altruistic or, environmentally minded people who are willing to pay, $30,000 to install their own solar photovoltaic system, or, will pay extra, as I did when I lived in Oregon, to buy wind power from Portland General Electric. But that's, a fairly small subset. So generally speaking, the big driver of early adoption of new technologies, particularly in the energy sector, is often the government. And so the way those policies are designed to spur early markets to provide incentives for further innovation and cost reductions are really important. So yeah, policy is a big lever. But I should say not the only lever, because I think it's difficult to imagine that we would support all of these technologies with subsidy in perpetuity forever. It's fairly easy for us to provide a 30% subsidy to solar photovoltaics when they provide less than 1.5% of our national energy supply, because it doesn't cost all that much more per person or per megawatt hour. But if solar became 50% of our energy supply and costs 30, 40, 50, 100% more, now we're going to start to see that cost in a more dramatic way, and I doubt that those kinds of policies are sustainable. So I think it goes, kind of goes both ways. One, policy is a big driver of the early market, but it takes real innovation and further cost reductions and new services and new technologies to ultimately get us to the end of the line, which is a global energy supply dominated by these sources of power rather than just having them be early niche suppliers.
Okay, great, thank you. And then just one other question, just in terms of thinking and from the student perspective. But as you work in MIT and as you do the things you do over in Massachusetts, and the students you work with perhaps, what do you think should be a priority for students to focus on as it relates to clean energy? What can they kind of get behind, or what can they put their emphasis and their focus and maybe their own human capital into?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the daunting things about this energy challenge is it's so big, that no individual person can solve it on their own. But that's also one of the maybe inspiring things, or one of the things that means there's many ways to get involved, is that it is so big that no one can solve it on their own, and there's tons of different pieces of this challenge. So for me, I've decided that my focus is going to be on studying and designing and helping implement the kinds of policies that help drive early innovation and adoption of these technologies, whether that's smarter subsidy programs for renewables, or whether that's the way we regulate electric utilities so that they can become early adopters of these technologies. So I've chosen a piece of the puzzle, and again, it's only a piece of it, which is how do we work on the policies that can drive a clean energy transition. But there are a lot of other pieces. I mean, if you're, as I mentioned earlier, if you're someone who is inclined towards the sciences or engineering, there's all kinds of direct, fundamental kind of innovation and engineering research challenges that go into any number of these technologies, whether it's developing, lighter or better materials for higher performing batteries for electric cars, or cheaper materials for solar PV panels, or lighter, stronger blades for wind turbines. I mean, there's all kinds of challenges there. There's people working in the biological sciences on how to engineer bacteria or algae to produce liquid fuels that can power our cars. There are people in social psychology or in business design or others that are trying to think about how do we overcome some of the behavioral challenges to adoption of these technologies or of energy efficiency improvements. So really, I mean, it seems like there's anywhere you look, there are pieces of this puzzle that you can put your mind to and your career to. And in some ways, that's one of the most exciting things about this field. I mean, I personally can't think of something that I would rather spend my my career, my time on more than trying to figure out how we can make clean, get clean, cheap energy to power the world. And that's that's a simple phrase, but it encompasses in it a whole bunch of different challenges that I think any number of people and hopefully the people listening to this conversation can see themselves picking up a piece of that.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you for the work that you're doing. Personally, I'm a big fan of your work through the Clean Energy Collective. And I thank you so much for being on this webinar today. I just want to skip over to these other slides, the last slide. I'm just talking about moving forward. If you are listening to this, you can get a copy of these slides just by contacting myself at sasha@focusthenation.org or Joshua at josh@focusthenation.org. And any information you have about these slides and information to come from, I think it would be okay. Would it be all right with you, Jesse, if we gave them your email address?
Yeah, that'd be fine. And I tried to note on the slides themselves usually what the source was if you wanted to track it down as well. But yeah, I'm happy to get emails from anybody.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, and with that, we are going to conclude our webinar session for today. Thank you again, Jesse Jenkins, and if you have any questions again, check us out at focusthenation.org.
Thanks.
Thank you.